Welcome to the pIBD Digest. This podcast explores paediatric inflammatory bowel disease, including Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. We're your hosts, Dr. Chris Bakewell and Dr. Tracy Coelho. In each episode, we'll discuss a specific aspect of paediatric IBD with an expert guest.
This podcast is intended for healthcare professionals involved in the care of children with IBD, as well as for patients and families seeking to better understand the condition. The views expressed are those of the speakers and should not replace professional medical advice. Hey Chris, last episode we rode the genomic roller coaster of IBD. Loops, twists and maybe a few elusive turns along the way. Hopefully our listeners have recovered and are now ready for something less granular and a little more clinical.
Yeah, hi Tracy, and welcome back everyone. And you're definitely speaking my language now. Don't get me wrong, it's not that I don't enjoy the basic science, but let's move out of the lab and back to the coalface of clinical medicine. So, what's on the itinerary today?
Right, we are heading to Scotland. Today's guest is Professor Richard Russell, Chair of the ESPGHAN IBD Porto Group, the European Society of Paediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology and Nutrition, and he's here to give us a pan-European perspective on paediatric IBD.
The dawn of paediatric IBD. So presumably we're expecting a repeat of that impromptu crane-top guitar solo that we had from our last Scottish guest, Dr. Richard Hanson.
I'm not sure if today's chat will summon the full Scottish spirit, but we have lined up plenty of questions from the work of the Porto IBD Group to pIBD trials and international collaborations. So I'm afraid music might have to take a backseat.
Well, fair enough. It sounds like you've packed a lot in. But, I'm sure we can accommodate some tasteful Scottish bagpipes just to set the mood.
Oh, Scottish bagpipes, I'm sure we can. And if anyone in paediatric gastroenterology deserves a haggis-worthy Robbie Burns style tribute, it's Professor Richard Russell. So here we go, inspired by the first stanza of the poem, Address to a Haggis by Robbie Burns, minus the charming Scottish accent. Great chieftain of the paediatric GI race, a renowned leader of the gutsy grace, above them all you take your place, an expert of pinch, tripe or tame, and all that exits the sonsy GI place. Fair fall, Professor Richard Russell, welcome to a humble podcast space.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very grateful for your very kind introduction. I have never been introduced to anything like that, never been. So I'm delighted to be with you, and thank you very much for your kind invitation.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Richard. We would like a breakdown of any criticisms or any comments you have for the ode at the end. So if you can make some notes, then we'd be grateful to receive them.
Thank you.
I hope Robbie Burns forgives me for this unsolicited corruption of his first stanza, but here we go.
He'd be delighted.
Richard, we've established that I can call you Richard, so that's fine. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Of course, your name will be hugely familiar to the vast majority of our listeners, but, we have a diverse listenership, some patients, some people that aren't necessarily medical, and we do like to get to know our guests. So if you'd be able to start by telling us a little bit about maybe your journey into medicine, specifically what drew you to pediatric gastroenterology and kids with inflammatory bowel disease.
Thanks very much. I guess looking back, it started off with a selection of these are the things I don't want to do rather than these are the things I do. I stumbled through medical school, but then, find myself very quickly into pediatrics, and it was very clear from my first job, to be honest, that pediatrics was for me. I think in terms of then pediatric gastroenterology, it happened a bit by chance and a bit by creation that I tried that, as many people will do in different subspecialties, and really liked it. And I think the draw for me particularly was, curiosity and trying to answer what seemed like difficult but meaningful questions. And I think a circle round, seeing patients, doing their investigations, doing their endoscopy, seeing their biopsy, seeing them back in clinic, and getting into a nice treatment cycle there. I think in terms of IBD within, being a subspecialist or a pIBDologist, that really came about when I met David Wilson in the late 1990s as he was setting up the service in Edinburgh. And then soon after, evolving into clinical research with him, and then laterally Jat Satsangi, who was Professor of Gastroenterology in Edinburgh, and then really for the past 20 years from there, paediatric IBD has been my main space. So, there was lots of questions to answer. We saw lots of children in Scotland, appearing before our eyes. The rapid rise was a big and meaningful question. And I think to have the opportunity to work with, to established people in the field who were very kind and supportive in the early days just really led me then onto that path, certainly within the UK. I guess from there, I've worked as a consultant in Glasgow and in Edinburgh, so in both of the main centres in Scotland. And then European work came after UK work. So I guess it was a kind of logical progression through different questions, different opportunities that arose. As I say, a lot of, I guess, people for earlier in their career think, how do you manage your career? And you can shape it to a certain extent, but a lot of it is just opportunities that arise at the right time. There's a creation to a certain extent, but actually sometimes the right thing just lands in your lap.
Awesome. Thank you. So, Richard, you are known for being a dynamic leader, a true powerhouse of knowledge and enthusiasm. And this becomes very evident, particularly when we attend national and international conferences. We always hear your voice around. Now, you've held key academic and clinical roles across Europe. So what inspired you to get involved with the ESPGHAN Porto Group, and how has your role evolved over the years within the organization?
So thank you. I think my last answer probably led into this one, really. So I think, things started off within ESPGHAN and the UK, but I think quickly I learned that the answers to the bigger or more difficult questions weren't answered by, working within any, country, wherever that country is. And really the only way we could really make meaningful difference was to involve lots of like-minded people from different centres. So I think my journey into IBD probably came through ECHO first, in the Paediatric ECHO Committee, which then led into the ESPGHAN Porto Group. I was probably responsible in some way for the ECHO ESPGHAN guidelines that subsequently evolved. So I'm sure my great friend and colleague Professor Dan Turner from Jerusalem, and we've shared over 20 years, various discussions about how we move the field forward. And one of those was around the creation of the first ECHO ESPGHAN guideline for acute severe colitis. So we met at a conference. We were the only two paediatric speakers. We said, this is ridiculous. We have higher rates of acute severe disease and the adults have these guidelines and we don't. He was around the evolution of the PUCAI score at that point. So we worked together there, and I think the guidelines led me into ECHO and then into ESPGHAN. I started in the Porto Group more than 10 years ago, and really it was through the guidelines and various projects stemming from them. And then I've been the Porto chair for the past 6 years. And really, the Porto Group, I think, has evolved from something which was seen as a relative clique for people that entered but never left, to a very dynamic and more diverse group of like-minded individuals in paediatric IBD from across Europe and beyond. So I think the intellectual, educational and advocacy draw of that group was a very natural place to progress through. And I've very much enjoyed and been privileged to be the chair of the group. I don't really do anything. It's all the hard work of the individuals from within the Porto Group. And to be honest, the the special interest group beyond there that are responsible for a lot of the turnover, within guidelines, within projects, and with other things we do within the group. I'm ready to give up the chair, only because my time has elapsed, and it's important that there is, diversity within the role and a good turnover. I think part of the issue with the group before was it lacked that turnover and fresh ideas and fresh energy. So Lissy de Ridder will take over as chair from January next year, but I will remain part of the group at least for a bit after that.
An up-and-comer in Lissy de Ridder. I will just mention, you just had the pIBD 2025 in Sorrento with the Porto Group. How was that? I wasn't lucky enough to go, but I've heard some good things.
So I think, this again, has evolved. So this was the 7th meeting, and the meetings happen roughly every 3 years, and they've been at various destinations throughout Europe. This was the second one in Italy, but they've been singly in different European countries up to this point. It was fantastic, and I think I'd forgotten how much of a great meeting it was just to focus on paediatric IBD and just have people there which are interested in that. Really gives a good sense of purpose and energy. And I hope we get the opportunity to talk about some of the outputs from that later. But I think other meetings, ECHO, ESPGHAN, do not just give us the time and space just to think solely about how can we make paediatric IBD better, what is the way forward, and not have, politely to say any other noise, and really get the chance to have, 4 days of solid paediatric IBD with speakers from across the globe. So it was really fantastic. I was enthused going into it anyway, and I felt more enthused coming out of it. And I think everybody was there felt the same sense of purpose and togetherness. So I'm glad it will continue. There was a doubt about whether it had a future before the 7th meeting, but ESPGHAN have very clearly said there will be a pIBD 8. We don't know where yet, but I think if you haven't had the chance to attend before, then it really is a different meeting to all the other ones that you will attend. And if you're in the world of paediatric IBD at any stage, I think you would find it very valuable and a very good use of your time. And often it's in a very nice place as well.
Doesn't hurt, does it?
Absolutely. Just a follow-on question from what Chris just asked. The Porto Group has a strong reputation for international collaboration. And although you've been modest from your previous response, I'm sure you are one of the strong drivers in this sphere. Now, how do you see the dynamics between European centers and partners beyond Europe evolving in the coming few years?
Good question. Thank you very much. I think so. I guess to shape it, we have 30 members of the Porto Group and the centres that they represent. In the IBD interest group, there are around 150 members representing about 130 centres, predominantly across Europe. We certainly have a strong Canadian interest, so the Canadians feel like part of ESPGHAN, although geographically, of course, they're not. Practically they are, and several members of the Porto Group are from Canada, so that lends itself to a foot naturally into North America. I think we've realised as the bigger issues come up that, speaking as an individual in Southampton and Edinburgh, we would have no chance of changing, meaningfully, big questions from regulatory agencies. And so working together within Europe, but then for the biggest question, showing that we have a global unity is the way forward. So I think, we've been able to work with NASPGHAN recently after a long period of not doing any joint guidelines in the sphere of IBD with them, to put out a joint position statement on really advocacy for children and paediatric clinical trials in IBD. And I think that will naturally evolve to involve, partners from all the different societies, I guess, under the umbrella of FISPGHAN or similar. And at the meeting in Sorrento, we were challenged to say, why did you write this just from your own perspective? And the answer is, you can imagine how difficult it is to get an opinion from across Europe and from across North America. And it took, lots of work, again, mostly by others, not by me, to bring together the core group of, around 30 people and write something which is, more than 12,000 words in length, and then agree on that. So if we're involving, South America, Asia, Australia, other places, then it would take forever. And the time it took to come out would then lose its meaning. So I think it's bright. I think there is generally a sense of cooperation and collaboration rather than competition, even between perhaps healthcare systems that are different to us and might naturally create a degree of competition rather than collaboration, but that does not seem to happen. And I think we're very good at having a unified purpose. And I think, I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that we write joint guidelines within paediatric GI societies from across the world. There are caveats, there are limitations. It's a very diverse group, but I see us moving more together rather than moving further apart.
Thank you. Now, as you have just mentioned, your time as Porto IBD Group Chair will elapse very soon. Now, this is not a serious question at all, but just checking if you have any aspirations to change the group name from the ESPGHAN Porto IBD Group to the ESPGHAN Edinburgh IBD Group before you finish your term.
I have no aspirations at all. And I think the name, I guess, is, synonymous with, good pediatric IBD research across the world. And although it's not branded officially, it is in reality. So people know the name, and I guess they know what goes with the name. So I guess a quality product most of the time, reliability, production of meaningful output. So that name will not be changing under any circumstances, especially none to do with me. So I don't think, we have the Porto criteria. We meet still traditionally in Porto. And one of the things I did try and change or suggest when I joined as chair was, could we hold it somewhere else? And we've held it there for the past 5 years. Tell what the answer was to that question. But I think it has too much of a good reputation. I hope the reputation is changing, because I think it's perceived by some people as an elite group, and it should not be viewed as that at all. And I think it's viewed by some as a group that only certain individuals can join. So I'm very glad this year to be able to tell you that people have joined from countries that are not as well represented as others. And for the first time ever, it's 3 women who are joining as the new elected people. So I think I've tried to stress the need for diversity within the group. And I think finally we're starting to see some of the historical issues that were associated with the group leaving, and people feeling free and able to apply for the group. So I think it's heading in the right direction, and the fact we have Lissy as chair will only add to that.
Very well answered.
So no Edinburgh criteria, no Edinburgh group.
Not the Russell group. There's already something else. So I think we probably should focus down then, because there are many things we could talk about in the world of pediatric IBD on this podcast, and having the opportunity to have you here, Richard, is really important to us and to the people listening. What we wanted to talk about was this, and you've touched on it already, is the approval of drugs to the pediatric market, because of course it's a big topic and one that you've published on and talked about a lot previously. You are the corresponding author for the Porto consensus statement, which responded to the FDA's draft on the guidance of pediatric IBD drug approval trials. That came out, I think you submitted it last year, it came out this year in publication. And that's, for anyone that doesn't know, that's a really important advocacy document for children with IBD, and not least of which was impressive to unite 95 different IBD experts across Europe. Would you be able to summarize firstly, your motivations for doing that. And I know you've touched on that a bit already, but why is it important to respond to that from a pediatric IBD perspective?
Yeah, thanks. And this will lead into something else, so I can give you some breaking news on the topic as well. So I think, we all realize wherever we work, the barriers they are to regulation of new advanced therapies within pediatrics, but working in the space, you'll realize every day that we have children who need these therapies and would benefit from them. And sometimes we don't have any access to them at all, or we have access only through clinical trials. So as part of advocacy work from ESPGHAN and from the Porto Group, we've tried to narrow this gap. So I guess to objectively summarize where we are, there are, or at the point we wrote that document, there were 3 advanced therapies licensed for children with IBD and 14 for adults. And the average time to approval from adult to pediatric approval sits at around 10 years. So I think it's easy for us to recognize that that's completely wrong. And we wanted to work with industry partners and the regulators to try and work into the future for all these advanced therapies to narrow or indeed remove that gap completely. So that was the motivation. And we have drugs, for example, I think vedolizumab is a great example of something which was approved in adults 10 years ago. Very good drug for ulcerative colitis particularly, and still has no pediatric license. And we've done, big studies like the VedoKids study where we've, prospectively followed and shown the efficacy in over 100 children from across Europe and still no license. So it's things like that where you have therapy dangled before your eyes. And I think particularly for our younger children, so children who are under age 12 or under 40 kilos, then particularly trying to get access. I know in some spaces is impossible, but certainly isn't very easy. So we wanted to change that. So the FDA launched their draft document. We responded to that, but then that actually formed in our mind a need for a bigger and more meaningful document. So we came together with our colleagues from NASPGHAN who are part of the initial document, and we've just produced, which was accepted into press the day before pIBD opened last month in October, a very large document which essentially has exhaustively gone through all of the different advanced therapies which have been approved in adults, so all 14, and looked at the relevant stage trial in pediatrics and looked to see whether there's any efficacy difference between drugs approved in adults and drugs approved in children. Spoiler alert, there isn't any difference. So really all of this, false delay is needless and is denying, a generation of our patients access to good therapies. So I think in terms of output, I would encourage everybody to read that document. It's weighty, I'll warn you. Take a morning and a coffee or 2 coffees to read it. But I think the headlines from it are to say we don't believe any drug trial needs to be done in children over age 12 or over 40 kilos. And you can have direct extrapolation of dose and efficacy from the adult phase 3 trial. And if we adopted that, at any point over the next few years, that would be a huge step forward. And although it may sound like a bold statement, honestly, look at the degree of detail within it. There are 3 systematic reviews contained within the paper to try and solidify the evidence both for the regulators and for industry for that. There is obviously then a need for our younger patients to have specific pharmacokinetic studies done, so you can't extrapolate for lighter patients. And it depends on the therapy in question as to whether it's under 30 or under 40 kilos you need to do those studies for. But broadly speaking, under 40 and under 12, you need a PK study between age 2 and age 12. And then under age 2 is its own group. And that is an orphan specialty that needs its own specific considerations. So that's where we've placed ourselves, and we will see how quickly or not that is adopted. But I think the strength of it is it's a joint North American and European statement. So I think people will sit up and look at it. The pharmaceutical company have listened to our previous advocacy work already. So some of the future drug trial designs have already taken into consideration some of the limitations of previous studies, which have led to slow time to adoption or slow time moving through patients through these trials. So, for example, we have called for an end to post-induction endoscopies. So you've had, roughly 3 months of treatment, and in adults, then they would look at mucosal healing as an outcome then to move on to the maintenance phase. We've called for that to be completely abandoned for children because it doesn't add any meaningful data on top of the adults, in the children's space. And and your listeners know that, the preparation for a colonoscopy, particularly as well as the procedure itself, is a big issue. And that is a very natural hurdle and limitation for people taking part in clinical research. So we want those completely to go, and have provided the evidence for that. Sorry for talking too much.
No, it's fantastic. And I'm sure Tracy will come on. We'll go through some of the specifics of that, the response that you wrote. But I think it's an excellent example of how you need to have this kind of synergistic relationship with the drug companies and the stakeholders in that. It's not a dirty thing to do. It's essential because you need to coordinate and target what is done within industry to make sure that there aren't delays and to maximize output of stuff that we desperately need. So, it's a really lovely point to make, and it sounds like a good afternoon I'll have after this reading the document.
I think what we suffered from before was a kind of copy and paste approach. So when pharmaceutical companies were designing the paediatric investigational plan, which they're mandated to do after the adult study, they just basically took the adult study and tried to, for example, half the dose or, do something, very basic. So we've worked with them to create now studies, and we have an example of one running just now. So the Macaroni 23 platform study, which has really taken into account the need for active therapy for children, and remove the need for placebo. So that, for those who don't know, is an active comparator between two drugs from two different drug companies within one clinical trial. So you only have one setup, and all of the patients within the trial will get, an active treatment. And those are the kind of changes that we're looking for, working with the companies to mean that we can have good trials going forward. Another example that, we've taken really from eosinophilic esophagitis. So their first biologic, the trial was done at age 12 and over in the phase 3 adult study. And there are now 2 studies coming out for IBD, which have adopted the same idea. So open label only for patients aged 12 to 18, but running in parallel rather than after the adult phase 3 study. So there is definitely progress being made, but no complacency. And we still have that gap in only 3 therapies. So we still need a rapid action, even though it sounds like we've made some progress. We need, a meaningful result.
Sure.
Perfect. Richard, you have already explained the rationale for responding to FDA's recommendations. You have alluded to the gaps that your team of authors have identified. But for our listeners who have not actually read the document, as I recall, there were 3 main disagreements, which, if I may summarize, one is the extrapolation of robust adult studies, which can be justified in pediatrics, and that we should focus on the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic aspects. You mentioned about 3 endoscopies, which are actually not required during the course of the treatment. If you could home in on that a bit more. And the third disagreement was about half placebo, which we haven't actually touched upon.
Yeah. So I guess that was a provisional document, and the subsequent document, which I've talked about, has harmonized and I think removed some of the disagreement. Some of it came from, I guess, lack of evidence, and we recognized that some of the disagreement was because we hadn't honed in on the evidence behind it. So to talk a bit about the endoscopies, so we have good non-invasive assessments that we can use, and for ulcerative colitis, I guess it's relatively easy because the PUCI score, despite its simplicity, is actually very good at recognizing active or inactive disease. And combining that with a calprotectin means that, the addition of a sigmoidoscopy or particularly a colonoscopy is not going to add much for that individual patient in terms of assessing response or remission to therapy. I guess for Crohn's disease, it's a little more complicated, but there is the mini index, which was devised now a few years ago, which is a composite score, for those who don't know it, between symptoms, blood tests and calprotectin, weighted strongly towards the calprotectin value, but taking into account these other things, which can very accurately reflect mucosal healing from a colonoscopy. So looking at the Crohn's disease simple endoscopy score, you can match that up with a mini score, meaning again, the need for colonoscopy, particularly at that 12-week point, is unnecessary. I think the mini index is not yet in most people's clinical practice at all, but has certainly been used in clinical research studies now. And as people use it and become more familiar with it, then it can move into drug trials. So we have done and published this year, for an example, a study using biosimilar adalimumab, and looked at outcomes using the mini as well as more traditional indices, and it works. It works very well. So I think we have a good way forward there. To touch on your last point about placebo, then of course all of us working in the sphere of paediatric IBD do not advocate for any placebo at all. We have a situation at the moment where some of the historical studies still have a degree of placebo in them. So all children get active treatment, but they may get pseudo placebo. So for example, they're given the drug less frequently than would be the adult label. So I'm just going to use a figure like 2 weekly or 8 weekly might be the adult one, and then in the trial they get it 4 weekly or 12 weekly. So that's kind of half or pseudo placebo. Or some trials still have every second injection as a placebo rather than as an active one. So we want to do away with them, and really moving forward, none of the newer studies should have that in them. The need for placebo-controlled trials, traditional ones from adults, has gone, and that's an old paper and an old piece of work which was published 5 or 6 years ago. And I think unless it was a new class of therapy with no adult trials, then that's the only justification you would have.
Great stuff, thank you. Now, just thought I'll mention, only recently we had a dedicated episode on placebo trials in IBD by your adult GI colleague, Dr. Shahida Din, who I'm sure you know very well.
Yes, I know Shahida very well, and we do transition the clinics with Shahida and the team at the Western General. I think she did a very comprehensive summary of why placebo is harmful. And I think there is obviously an argument, and I'm sure she went into it, I haven't heard the whole episode, as to why you shouldn't use it in adults, never mind children. So I think there are lots of, important work in that space, and it might be that actually we can help our adult colleagues understand why, that isn't the case and why it's removed from pediatric studies. So I guess reverse cross-fertilization.
Yeah. So in your recommendations to the FDA, you also proposed as indirect measures of assessment. One of them is intestinal ultrasound as an alternative to invasive procedures. Now, interestingly, we will soon be featuring 2 episodes on the use of intestinal ultrasound in the upcoming months, or very soon. Now, is this approach adopted by a unit, and how is it catching up at the moment?
So I think it's, it fits in perfectly, doesn't it, for pediatrics into non-invasive assessments, and, avoids or reduces the need for endoscopy. I think there are some areas and countries in the world that have adopted this very well. I think in the UK we're behind the curve for sure, and some of that is just the setup that we have. And I'm sure I don't want to steal any thunder from your future speakers, but I think one of the issues that we need to solve in the UK is who actually does them. So is it the gastroenterologist who does it, or is it the radiologist who does it? And what is the buy-in of both? I think it's great. The data are very supportive for it, and we do use it at the moment, clinically for particularly patients with acute severe colitis. But we don't have perfect buy-in from radiology, and I don't think I know the answer really to who should be doing this. So I know certainly within the adult clinic in Edinburgh, patients who are flaring can go through to the next room and have one of the gastroenterologists do their ultrasound, and then they have their, treatment and management adjusted, while they're in clinic. So it is part of it. I don't think we understand it fully, but it is being adopted as a secondary outcome, certainly into one of the new drug trials we're starting next year. So it is in the, the eyes of pharmaceutical companies, at least. The regulators, haven't made a decision on it at present. So it's an interesting secondary outcome just now for clinical trials. In terms of clinical practice, I think this is one thing that is a UK specific issue that we need to tackle as a group of paediatric IBD centres within the UK and decide, how we're going to integrate this into our practice. I don't think, it's a question, should we? I think the answer is yes. I think it's how we do that. So you've got me as an active listener for future podcasts.
He knows what he's doing, this guy. Fine. So I guess let's move the conversation on a little bit. And I wanted to maybe step back a tiny bit from the drug trials themselves to the regulation of drug trials and how we sort of make the world a bit smaller in terms of what needs to be done in different regions. And there's been work done by yourself and other people about harmonizing pediatric drug trial development to avoid, for example, the need to duplicate trials in different parts of the world that would obviously delay regulatory approval, but also maybe pass costs on to healthcare providers, or in certain areas of the world like these states, pass it on to the patient themselves. What do you think are the biggest challenges, and that's maybe a difficult question to answer, of achieving that alignment, for example, between places like the FDA and the European equivalent, the EMA, and others worldwide? How do you make the world smaller and get approval in a larger area?
So I think it's to show that it works in one area, and I think, if we can show it works in Europe and the EMA are, can demonstrate that, then I think it would put pressure to the FDA and other regulatory organisations to adopt something similar. And I think that pressure would come from patients and families predominantly, and they would find that harder to resist than, healthcare professionals. There are, just practical hurdles within different regions of the world and different, rules which govern their healthcare systems that are hard to overcome. And there is always going to be a need for at least some local, to the region, and by the region that can mean a continent, trials there. So, for example, in Japan, you have to have some Japanese presence in these studies, or they will not adopt the therapy. So, I think it's a big piece of work to change that. But I think, to answer your question, leading by example and demonstrating we can do this within Europe will then give examples over different areas of the world. I think aligned to that question is really access to therapies, over the world, both through clinical trials and through, standard mechanisms. And I think we're very keen as a group to not have, a situation where we then have adoption of advanced therapies within, Western Europe, but then other parts of Europe or other parts of the world can't access them. So I think the next logical step of what we do is to advocate to pharmaceutical companies, if we're taking part in your trials and if we're, part of regulation, that regulation includes all, communities who have pediatric IBD patients in them. And if that means, subsidizing costs in other places, or it means designing clinical trials which can run more simply within the resources of different populations, then that's exactly what we could do. But that work is in relative infancy at the moment, so we're advocating for it, but I don't think we are, making huge steps forward. We tried to cover the issue at the World Paediatric meeting last year in Argentina, and I think what we learned particularly when we're talking about dietary therapies, for example, that food security is a huge issue. And, these are issues which really fall out of, healthcare's remit really, but actually have direct implications for some of the therapies that we're using. So it almost becomes geopolitical and then, far too much for us to think about. So I think we need to take meaningful steps forward, leading by example, starting in one area and then trying to spread that message from that area, further afield. But it is a difficult to solve and, not too difficult a question to answer, but, meaningful change is hard in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. And as my next question was going to be, because we're about to record an episode on pediatric IBD in India, we have a series where we sort of explore IBD prevalence and how care differs around the world. And I was going to ask you how you think we increase that engagement with maybe developing nations who are about to see that rise in IBD, who are already seeing that rise in IBD, because of course the funding comes predominantly, or the input comes predominantly from countries that already have that very high prevalence and likely to increase prevalence in the very early onset IBD, like in North America, Canada, Scotland, UK.
Yeah, and I think the first thing is to understand that, the local situation. So to have people from India speaking and understanding the nuances, so for example, the prevalence of TB is, much higher there, and the differential diagnosis is different, and the pathway to diagnosis is different even before you get onto treatment. And then understanding, what the barriers are, trying to give examples of, things that we've learned that can be adopted, but then also recognizing that, the situation in some ways is different. That there is the first guideline for investigation and treatment in, developing countries, which came out from ESPGHAN last year after a long and slightly, difficult incarnation, I have to say, because, it's such a diverse group. But, India is a huge country, and, just understanding the geography and what goes on there and working with colleagues there in a meaningful way would, I think, help, move things forward, recognizing that, there are all sorts of barriers, some of which we can predict and some of which we don't know. I've heard, some great talks and really learned a lot from colleagues who work there, and some of the perhaps the assumptions that we have aren't true in both directions. But I think it's to reach out and to work meaningfully with everywhere. Recognizing that we don't have all of the answers to the problems.
Sure, thank you. So I guess you've talked very well on some really important topics, and you're now, as you've mentioned, about to step down from the chair in the Porto Group, and Dr. Richar is going to step up and become the lead of the Porto Group. What do you think the next decade holds for that group and for pediatric IBD generally as a discipline?
I think, touched on diversity within the group, and I think it's important that continues to progress and expand. I think there'll always be a need for refreshment of the guidelines, which have been, a big focus. So we're on the third incarnation of both. So UC published this year, Crohn's disease will be presented and published just at the start of next year. So I guess that's the core work of the group, but it needs to continue. Whether we can reduce the time, so it's a 5-year cycle between guidelines, which, recently certainly a lot changes within that period. So whether we can shorten that would be a good thing. I think the big things that we base a lot of our practice on, like diagnostic guidelines, so the revised Porto criteria are very old and need to be refreshed in line with, modern ways of investigation and working. So that's one thing, and it's a big thing to undertake. I think the phenotypic classification, which it sits, I guess, more with research than with clinical care a lot of the time, is also being revised at the moment. And, this will be the first all-age phenotypic classification that we have. So that will need to be assessed, adopted, and modified. So it's the IBD 25 classification. They stemmed away from calling it Edinburgh, Southampton, Florence was where they met, so I would have thought that would have been a perfect name for the phenotypic classification, but they said no because they want to give it a dynamic feel, and so they'll just redo the number when it gets refreshed. And I think we do have a need for continuing collaborative, research across Europe, and trying as much as possible, for some of the reasons you've touched on, to spread that out beyond Europe as much as we can. So we have a very good network. We have a very smooth running machine of new advanced therapies which come along, small usage within centres, but then, so hepatocitinib would be a great example of a new therapy to paediatrics. And we've been very able quickly to get experience in more than 100 patients, both in induction and maintenance, and both for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, which would take, 6 or 7 years within the context of, normal clinical trials. So that needs to continue to evolve, but I think it's, a fine running machine. And some of what the future is just making sure nothing steps back, and then fine tuning some of the other things going forward.
Sure. Sounds very much like you've greased the cogs of progress. Watch them work away.
Well, hopefully. Other people have. Yeah. Honestly, I'm maybe the oiler, but the cogs are everybody else. The strength is in the bread and the hard work of all of the team. And really all you do as part of the executive is just help steer things in the right direction.
Perfect. Richard, it's been an inspiring discussion, full of insights and plenty for all of us to digest. So as we wrap up, I would like to end with a verse inspired again by the final stanza of Robbie Burns, addressed to a haggis. And this is my call, not to the powers that dish out Scotland's dinner, but to the scientific community, including yourself, to keep serving up new discoveries. And again, sadly, my version comes without the charming Scottish accent. You, the powers of IBD, with the sickest children under your care, you who dish them out the biologic bill of fare, the good old IBD land wants no skinking wear, or one that leaves unhealed sores within your stare. So if you really wish to hear our grateful prayer, look a bit harder, it's all there. Give us that elusive science lost in the glare. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's brilliant. Robbie Burns is delighted with it. I know that.
I hope he is.
Yeah, no, he loves it.
It's something.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Cool. All right. Thanks very much.
And to our listeners, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. See you next time. Bye for now.